We're going to get started this morning. So, my name is Rick Leib. I run the Virtual CISO organization with Access Point. So that is my department, if you will. My role here is to act as a moderator and help add and aid this discussion. Today, we're going to talk about insider threat, how to detect and how to deter it. And with me, I have two special guests. I have Jeff Hancock and Joe Bruffy with me. And I'm going to ask Joe to go ahead and introduce himself and his experience, a little bit of his background, and then I'll ask Jeff to do the same thing. So my experience is a CISSP, 35 years of experience in the business. So I've been around mom and pops and have managed large networks as far as 144 offices spanning 6 continents. So at that point, I'm going to ask Joe to go ahead and introduce yourself. Hey, Joe, go ahead.
Hey, yes, I'm Joe Bruffy. Yeah, I've been in the space for a little over 20 years, probably about 25 years. Managed everything from large infrastructures for large companies, small governments, small businesses, healthcare, and whatnot.
Jeff, why don't you introduce yourself?
Cool.
Not everybody knows who you are. And yours.
Jeff Hancock. I've been in cybersecurity for over 25 years. Military, intelligence community, and then private sector for a long time. Been a CISO for, 18 years now. So it's been a while. As it relates to our conversation today on insider threat, I've built 14 programs, insider threat programs for 14 different organizations, government, a few government, and then the rest private sector over the last 15 years or so now. I'm also involved in the National Insider Threat Task Force. That's out here. I live on the East Coast, so it's not too far from me. Their headquarters are not too far from me. It's hosted by the Director of National Intelligence. It's an interesting group of people. We really work across the board, government and industry. So I've broad experience running security operations, building SOCs, running SOCs as a CISO, as an engineer. But then on the flip side of that, I've also spent a significant amount of time in the last 10 years, 15 years in particular, working with the CIOs and CISOs, CIOs and CEOs of organizations to really help them understand the business value of security, insider threats as well. So kind of have a both sides of the coin. I've been a CISO. I've also worked with CISOs as a field CISO. So it's a broad experience there.
Nice.
Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, we're happy to have you here, Jeff. Anytime. We'd love to have you back as often as you'd like to. So today's topic, like I said, is how to detect and deter insider threats. And Jeff's got a lot of NIST experience as well, which is really helpful. And Joe's got a lot of experience. So I'm going to go ahead and kick the chat conversation off a little bit and kind of set the tone, if you will. So as a CISO myself, the largest threat I've ever seen to any organizations comes from the inside, right? Now, it could be permissions issue based. It could be nefarious or malicious intent, which is extremely rare, but it does happen, but it's very rare. Usually where I see the insider threat come from is somebody accidentally doing something. They didn't even know that they were doing anything wrong, and it just happened. They've deleted the, CFO's data files or something along those lines. Or they've opened up an email, that has, some malicious attachment attached to it. And lo and behold, you've got 500 workstations and 20 servers immediately encrypted, right? Or worse, you don't have those immediately encrypted. You start exfiltrating data, then they wait a little while, then they encrypt them all. So I'm going to stand back and I'm going to ask Joe. Joe, in your experience, what are some of the things that you have seen or insider threat where we could have done better, or the company could have done better, or things that they should have looked out for that they didn't look out for, that they didn't realize to look for?
Sure. Well, the biggest thing is a lot of people or a lot of organizations don't turn on any user entity behavior analytics or anything in that space. There's a lot of underutilized technologies in the machine learning and that kind of space. It's there's certainly a lot of behaviors that we understand that they're malicious, not necessarily malicious, but not desired or sanctioned, that do kick off that we can automatically block, but we have to be aware of them. We have to ingest, the logs in and actually find those behaviors and define them.
Jeff, how about you? Same question to you.
What have I seen?
Yes.
In the space, or
what have you seen? What could have been avoided? Things like that.
Yeah. So I think to both of your points, really, there's when you look at insider threats, not many are malicious, but those are the ones that people know about, right? So a lot of companies, a lot of federal agencies, is there a requirement to announce that they have an insider threat attack or something malicious is going on? Not necessarily. If there's a public breach and it fits certain standards, and the company's required to. But by the way, there's 51 different standards, one for each state, that companies have to apply breach response times and standard and reporting requirements to, which is crazy, right? So back to the point, reporting an insider threat breach is embarrassing to the company, right? So how do you do that? Exactly. How do you do that in a way? How do you rectify that and solve that problem? I think there's more insider threat going on than people are willing to admit, because one, it's difficult. They might get confused with how to identify it. Two, what Joe said, the user behavior analytics, man, I mean, you can say there's a product for that, but it's always about tweaking that product to fit your environment and what you need, right, Joe? I mean, you gotta massage
absolutely.
it. Yeah, but
No, you're absolutely correct. Getting it to fit your environment is very important, because there might be a velocity of events that can go out, or there might be something that's normal for a user that then is not normal. So that might be more to the malicious side. But then there's the fact that, okay, this user doesn't normally send things out, or we don't want this leaving through that channel. And having the blocks for that. So having a solid DLP, solid conditional access program, all that. I mean, all these layers really add up to help mitigate insider threat.
Yep. Have you seen? Quick question, Joe, real quick. Have you seen organizations like try to answer that user behavioral analytics challenge? Like, well, we have to apply this to everybody, or do they slow down and kind of do an assessment and say, well, we don't need to do it to everybody. We need to apply behavioral analytics to this data, and then figure out who. I mean, what do you guys?
Yeah, but I have a background, so that specifically is worked on extensively in the HIPAA background, in your healthcare background, because of the sensitivity of medical records. Break the glass type environments are there. An example was I worked with a hospital system that a movie star came into and was injured and came in. They took care of the movie star, and off that person went and did their job. And about 2 weeks later, we had to report 14 HIPAA violations to OCR, which was not a lot of fun. To either had to have the conversations with our own employees. Why did you go look at the movie star's records? What were you doing? Why were you doing that? Congratulations, you've lost your job. And then we had to report that to the privacy officer. The privacy officer did their thing. HR did their thing. But just to answer your question specifically, I have seen that very targeted in the healthcare environment.
Yep. I agree. I think that's where, broadly speaking, as a CISO, when you're running programs like this, user behavioral analytics is an element of the program, the tactical element of the program, but there's other things ahead of that that need to be defined, right? So, really, let me explain it this way real quick. It's kind of like a layer cake with 3 layers. In the bottom level, you have, and I'll use this as a reference point. At the bottom level, you have there's 14 technical disciplines in cybersecurity. 2 of those the government uses, so let's put those aside for a second. So let's say there's 12 technical disciplines in security that everybody does. DHS does all 12. Kmart, if they're still around, might do 4 of the 12. So it just depends on the size and scope of your organization. But that's where you see really incident response, forensics, a variety of things of very tactical hands-on keyboard as a cyber discipline, technical discipline at the tactical level. One level up is the operational level. That operational level is where you have a SOC, where you have a third-party security program, where you have cloud security. Those are programmatics that require elements of those tactical disciplines, but then they also bring in IT or some executive information or consumer data, that kind of thing. So that's at the operational level. At that operational level, that's where insider threat programs have sat for me when I've developed them. At that operational level, so I've got to pull from different technologies. User behavioral analytics is one of those, subset programs that you bring in, but you've got to be able to understand what technical pieces come in, then operationalize it from a program plan perspective. And the last level is that enterprise level, the strategic level, where for an insider threat program, you've got to have a sponsor. You've got to have key stakeholders. You've got to know, you engage the senior executives of different divisions for your insider threat program. For chief legal counsel, head of HR, physical security, if you've got that, the CIO, right? Those are key people that you need to develop a program. again, the overarching umbrella program for an insider threat, effort in your organization. And then within that, you break that down into what's practical for your organization, right? Threat modeling, user behavioral analytics, like Joe mentioned, is key. Because again, you can't apply that to everybody, because then the cost goes to the floor clearly when you do that. But
it's difficult. Also, too much information. So yeah, targeting does help absolutely. But speaking of that, how have you, in your history, Jeff? How do you, or what is your preferred method to monitor user activity? So you're looking for that insider threat. What are you typically looking for? We all talk about end user behavior analytics. We talk about, some of the very basics, but what are some of the things that you look for specifically when you monitor for end user activity or end user inactivity? What do you look for to find an insider threat potentially moving around, moving laterally?
Sure.
What are some of the techniques you use?
Yeah, so I think I overlap looking at insider threats with looking at just malicious actors. Step one of a malicious actor is to look like he belongs there, he or she belongs in your organization, right? So there's a crossover when you approach it from that perspective, and you've got to look at it like, okay, what's my intent? Initially, bad actors, when they get into the network, they find a dark corner and sit and watch and pay attention and gather data. They don't just go charging in and start stealing information, exfilling it. They understand. They really do a mapping of the network, both physical, but then operational. How operationalized is this network? How many people access to this data versus that data? Why is that important? So those types of methods are key. And you develop a threat actor profile, right? And that threat actor profile is based on really, at a fundamental level for this call, based on two things. What bad actors might want my information, one, and two, what information is most valuable to other people that I have, right? So using that perspective, you develop that profile. How that fits to insider threat, very similar, right? You take user behavior Linux and set that aside for a second. What's the profile of somebody who's going to be marching through my network trying to get access? Who would want most important information? Who would want to be able to access finance data, or budgetary, programmatic budgetary data, or whatever M&A information? What's that look like, right? We've had people, I've worked with organizations where they're trying to figure out an insider threat program development plan that we're putting together for them, also doing an M&A. At the same time, chief counsel is responsible for doing the M&A. They bring an outside consultant or two or three, and then outside consultant all of a sudden has access to some pretty classified, corporately classified information. And they're touching that data on weekends, at home, unsecured network, right? And you're like, okay, this is going to be a problem here, right? So it's a couple things, but I think at its foundation is developing that program, that perspective of what's that threat actor look like, whether they're insider or not. What will be bad actor behavior within my network? What's the most important thing? And I think if you start there, you're able to really back into what a person looks like, what a behavior looks like. And then, to Joe's point, you apply user behavioral analytics to that profile. And you're like, oh, wait a second. Billy Bubba in the warehouse really doesn't care about corporate M&A data, but oddly enough, he's accessing that at 5:00 on a Friday. Why is he doing that? It's a little unusual, right? Because you've developed an understanding of that corporate M&A data is targeted and will be targeted. So how do you provide that format around it to chase it down? So it's a couple of spinning plates there, but at its core, you kind of look at those two things. That threat actor profile is key.
So some of the technologies that you've used in the past, how have you tried to detect? How have you detected end user, insider threat? What are some of the things that you've done look for outside of just user behavior analytics?
Well, there's lots of different things that you can look at for insider threat. I mean, even just as simple as toxic role combinations, making sure that your access controls are set correctly. Because users shouldn't necessarily be accessing certain data. So why do they have access? There could be scope creep. Something as simple as that. That's an age-old problem where users, they change roles and they maintain their permissions as they're moving from role to role, and all of a sudden they're God essentially. They own everything. There's also watching lateral movement. Because obviously once you get the insider or any threat, they can start moving east west or north south. So how do you segment those off? Like that's another way to prevent insider issues. So if you can't get from one endpoint to the other, or you can only get to certain services, that helps a lot. So I mean, just architecture alone can help a lot in the insider threat profile.
That's the one area I've seen that a lot of people seem to somehow miss is when you do a business impact analysis, for example. So we're going to look at an impact on the business. A lot of times you go through the BIA practice and we find systems that people forgot about, processes running that have been abandoned. Now they're at risk and they're an insider threat because nobody's watching them. Nobody knows what's happening with them. They're still doing whatever they're trying to do and they can be exploited. And have you guys seen anything along those lines in the past where abandoned processes could potentially be an insider threat or be abused by an insider threat? Jeff, have you seen anything along those lines?
In the energy sector in particular, right? Old manufacturing or OT systems that people are like, don't touch it. It works great. It does these 5 things. We don't want anybody laying their fingers on it. Okay, but it's open to the internet. I don't care, right? And you've got to convince people that, okay, I understand, but we're going to have to segment off your network a little bit, micro segment it off over here, make it harder, build an enclave, make it more difficult for that network to access the core data. And there you can keep doing what you're doing, but and that was a solution. But at that point, that conversation I had was after they had already identified a pretty significant breach. And that's how the bad guys got in, right? They look like one of the guys in the field who'd log on 3 times a day, checking certain systems. And he did it at home one too many times. And a bad actor found out and said, oh, wait, I can access this through his network and and they were compromised.
I find encryption helps from the healthcare background. Encryption at rest, encryption in motion, encryption during processing really does help. Because the reality is if you get breached with encrypted data, not breached. There's no data breach. Let me rephrase that. You're still breached, but there's no data breach. Let me rephrase that and be very clear. That's one thing we've always looked at. So, Joe, do you recommend use like background check investigations, building a culture of trust and openness, or educating your employees on your insider threats? Have you recommended any of these in the past, or worked with any of these in the past? Any of these ideas?
Yeah, definitely. Obviously having a culture of trust, having training people in simple stuff, just even like how to avoid phishing emails, how to report that. Training is a big portion of eliminating the unintended insider threat. That's become even more so lately. I've even seen a lot of smishing attempts lately. And some people are getting better at responding to those, and some aren't. Because you get the people that get it right away, and the people that fail 20 phishing tests in a row.
So, Jeff, what is your advice to, say, a new CISO? So if somebody's new to becoming a CISO, and this is one of the, in my opinion, now I could be wrong, but in my opinion, this is one of the biggest threats that face InfoSec, period. Across the board, pretty much government or small business, large business enterprise is insider threat. That's just my nickel. What advice would you give a new CISO that would be coming into the role, specifically around insider threats, detection, deterrence? What information or what advice would you offer?
It's two-pronged approach. There is the business side, because the business function is what's going to provide you the biggest risk regarding insider threat, because the business is going to want to do whatever they want to do. So you're going to have to address that issue. But then certainly there's the technical side, which is IT and cyber, which gets to, I think, what point Joe was making earlier about architecture. Like looking at your architecture to make sure that from the IT side, which cyber doesn't control typically, that the IT architecture is designed in such a way that critical data is encrypted. Rick, to your point, is segmented off, right? You only have 5 people accessing the data instead of 25 people accessing the data who need it, right? But I think it's specifically for insider threat programs, it's about 5 things, right? It's developing the enterprise program, which is sitting down with your executive team and saying, okay, we need a program for this. We need some person to be the quarterback who, when something goes sideways, they're on point to manage this program. The second thing is obviously identify the team, right? And that means, again, it's not just cyber, right? It's IT, it's HR, it's legal, it's the business owners. Right? All of a sudden they are on point here. If something goes sideways, everybody gets on the joint 1-800 call, oh crap, and start having a conversation, start figuring out what's going on. The third thing is really around doing a risk assessment. So from a CISO's perspective, looking at your organization from an inside threat point of view and doing a risk assessment. What are bad actors? Who are they going after? What does their threat profile look like for me in the organization, for my executives in the organization? Just to identify and narrow down, because you can't get everybody. So let's start like a rock in a pond, right? You throw a rock in a pond, and that closest concentric circle is the one you focus on, not the 15 that go out in the pond. So as a CISO, you focus on the most important data in that circle, and then go out if you need to. The really it's 1, 2, 3. Really, is building out that process. The last thing is building out the program itself, which means obviously engaging those stakeholders that I mentioned earlier, but going so far as to actually build out a tabletop exercise. So one example comes to mind real quick is an organization I work with, and they saw the need for it. Global company. They had a CISO, but the CISO wasn't too engaged in the process. But they knew they had to have a program plan in place. So what we ended up doing, long story short, was we created a series of playbooks once a month for 90 minutes. All the executives who had a stake in this, in the Insider Threat program, would get on a call and they'd walk through their playbook. So the CISO would monthly for 90 minutes.
Yeah. That's awesome.
So, and the CISO had the job of making sure the playbook was updated for everybody. Like, this is your role, HR. And would come up with an actually story plan. And the CISO would say, all right, everybody's on the call. All right, here's what I'm updating you on. We've got this breach. We found it in HR, blah, blah, blah. HR, what do you do? And HR turns to their playbook, page 17. Oh, I need to go do this and this and this and this and this. And that really helped the leadership, the stakeholders, understand that for 90 minutes a month, that's all we need you to do. We need you to know what to do, what page to turn to, and the CISO will take care of everything else. Right?
That's awesome.
That builds a good program. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that really kind of streamline the program. Launched it in the US, launched it in Canada, and then kicked it overseas for the overseas team in EMEA. And it worked well because everybody knew they had that stakeholder responsibility. And everybody was like, oh, a tabletop exercise. This could be fun. And the HR people were like, hey, look, I'm doing cybersecurity and I'm in HR. Right? So it was kind of a little interesting thing for them to get a window into cybersecurity, and they contributed and they had a participant play in that, right? Not everybody viewed it that way, right? Chief legal counsel was like, why am I here?
Yes, exactly. Happens a lot.
And then you got to convince them, hey, look, when things go sideways, chief legal counsel, you are going to be on point because there's going to be legal issues.
You want to be in the boardroom, which would be
yeah. Right. Yeah. So those are fun to do, but I think those are the 5 things I would recommend.
Okay.
5 points.
So Joe, we got a question from the audience. So I'm going to throw this at Joe specifically. So Joe, the question is, how can we find insider threats if genuine credentials are used for malicious intention by attackers?
Now, that's interesting. So it really depends. This is where the UEBA comes in. So if you understand that, they only operate, a user usually operates in certain hours, certain days of the week, only accesses data at a certain rate, that helps a lot. Now, as far as recognizing it, that can be very difficult. If it's just one thing at a time here and there, it's going to be very difficult. But typically, a bad actor is going to try to grab as much as they can before they get shut down. If they haven't just been sitting there forever, and you'll see that. There are ways to mitigate against that kind of a threat, though. There's just-in-time access and authorizations that can be used. So let's say you're using, some type of CRM where, you're required to validate information before you can even see the records. So that's one way to mitigate against that, because you won't even have access to it yourself until you validate that. So you can't just go look at patient records. That could help in that case that you're talking about with this celebrity. But yeah, I mean, that's probably the thing, is that if it's just one thing at a time, there's not much you can really do, but unless there's a time frame.
Yeah, I worked for a financial services company. Won't mention their name in the past. Anyhow, they had issues with salespeople stealing the leads. They would decide to resign, and when they decided to resign, they would dump all their contacts and take them with them, or to dump all their leads and take them with them, or send them over to the new company first and then resign. So I think, I'm not sure where this question came from, but I'm assuming that may be along the lines they're asking, because it was using legitimate credentials, and they were just asking, how do we detect it? So
so that would just be a behavior, So obviously, if you didn't want somebody to dump credentials out, you can watch for that specifically. Like, oh, they exported their, email contacts, or they exported from here. That would be just a behavior to watch. So that should be caught in like a UEBA type of situation, as long as you're feeding those logs in. So there's obviously can't watch everyone with traditional UEBA, but newer stuff based on machine learning actually can take a lot more of that in. You can build models around that. Machine learning can be used to amplify your force, but a lot of people just set it up and think they're all set forever, but that's not true. You need threat. That's where you get your threat hunters in there, watching for these patterns and parsing through the data to see if there's any new potential threats. And modeling those threats, having those tabletops, having these larger discussions of what should be happening, talking with departments, saying, "Hey, is this a normal behavior, or what should happen in your process?" So you go through all their processes. That's where you're going to find that stuff.
So with processes, would you recommend, Jeff, processes such as DLP, data loss prevention? And would that help in this particular question? This person's question. I mean, so like I said, they're asking how can we find insider threats if genuine credentials are used for malicious intentions by attackers? So would DLP play a role in something along those lines, or those types of technologies?
As an alert, absolutely.
Okay.
But I think because obviously, exfilling data, large amounts of data, you want to be able to have it controlled, and DLP can help manage and monitor that kind of thing. But I think the question, to me, the answer to that question really relies on, I think, what Joe just said, behavior. I think you, Rick, said that too, right? You've got to wait for the behavior of somebody before you can identify it based on the example that the question is based in. But I think and this is where it gets a little tricky. So I'm going to give an example. When an organization is going through a layoff or a merge or unfortunately, and this is the hard conversation because then it gets into user privacy issues. Are there people who, you're going to move out of the organization? Well, then are they a higher threat to your organization? So how do you, as the CEO, as the CIO, as the CISO, monitor those particular people? Can't tell you how many times I've seen that happen. An example is years ago, the OPM breach comes to mind, right? So the OPM breach, it happened because there was a contractor who sold it to a contractor in the U.S., leveraged a contractor in Brazil.
Wow.
On call phone support, totally unsecure network that was swiped by some folks in China.
Yeah.
Right. But the whole process there of how that contractor said, "Oh well, government's not going to pay us enough money to do this ourselves, so we're going to have to outsource it at a really cheap rate," and the government didn't have a clue. So that kind of process, you've got to think about, who am I putting in the driver's seat? What business decisions am I making that are going to impact the people who are accessing the data or not going to be accessing the data anymore? And what's that risk look like? So that threat profile I mentioned earlier, it's very key to be able to look at it that way and understand how that works, because you could be, everything is great, everything is wonderful, and drive yourself off a cliff and not even know it. So challenging.
Yeah, it is absolutely. So in my experience, zero trust, true zero trust, not just saying with zero trust, but actual zero trust does help in this scenario because you're microsegmenting, you're just in time permissions, just enough permissions, et cetera. Joe, have you seen the same thing? I mean, where zero trust has hindered the ability for someone to be an insider threat? Have you seen that?
Absolutely. Just-in-time access is a really good example. So if I need to get an approval to put on a role that would allow me to make a change or to export data, and if you have the proper role set up, so I might have, an overall global admin, and I'll have a security admin level, I'll have a security viewer level. Day to day, I probably need to view, and I might need to admin. But anything higher than that, if we have authorizations from other people to be able to export that stuff, that makes a huge dent into that. And of course, there's a lot more to zero trust, securing all the communications and how you get the authorizations. But as far as it goes for just-in-time permissions, that's been a huge asset. Sometimes it slows you down in your changes a little bit, but I find that that's acceptable. I mean, because because most organizations don't start with it, so they move into a model with authorizations. So they start off, they don't have a change board, they don't have anything, they have a change board and they still have their full, fat admin, and they go through and they just do whatever they need to do when they say they're going to do it, or they might do it ahead of time, pre-stage, but they didn't put that in their plan. So if you go back and actually audit that plan, things were done in the wrong times, and that can be a threat on its own. Because maybe they'll access stuff they shouldn't, or maybe they'll get hit with ransomware attack while they're doing that, or they'll download a tool that they shouldn't, just out of process. But if they didn't have these rights in the first place, with the zero trust model, they wouldn't be able to install that app. They wouldn't be able to go outside of the normal, patterns and behaviors that you set up. So you can kind of enforce behaviors, and that gets back into the behavioral analytics. It's a lot easier to control or find bad behaviors if you control the behaviors in the first place.
So, Jeff, we got a question from the audience. I'm going to throw it at Jeff. So, can we automate processes to find insider threats through playbooks or any other methods?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, the advantage of doing that is that there's a lot of playbooks, typical cyber operations playbooks that organizations already have that you can leverage. So you don't have to start from scratch, but you have an incident response plan. What's it based on? A threat? Well, what kind of threat? How do you profile that threat? Right. So it's the same idea. You have the same templates, the same process, maybe the same playbooks, but you tune them a bit more to what your inside risk could be. I think that's certainly more controllable when you do it the way we just described it. When looking in the wild and you're looking at, as a CISO, you're looking out across the world, there's a whole lot more unknowns and uncontrollable things that you got to manage. Inside your organization, it's a lot easier because you've got support, you've got access to your networks. You can do what you need to do. Using that as a good template to be able to say, okay, from a threat perspective, a threat modeling perspective, or a threat actor perspective, what would they go after? Where are playbooks aligned with that? What technologies would somebody leverage to be able to access data, exfil data? What does that process look like? I mean, a long time ago, Lockheed Martin came up with the kill chain.
Yep.
D&I came up with one that I thought that combined like 4 different kill chains that have come out over the years. I think it was in 2016. D&I came out with their own that kind of mapped to everybody's, which is really good. Using that kill chain model for an insider threat is actually not a bad place to start because it looks at where your risks are. It helps you focus down on what's most critical in your organization and what to do about it. So
yeah, I did
that's what I do. Yeah, it works really well. But that would be something you could build and then automate into your current processes. Like I said, tuned a little bit differently instead of over here for security, over here to insider threat a little bit. So,
yeah. Okay. So, would you guys recommend using any antivirus, anti-malware solutions, patch management systems to kind of help reduce the insider threat potential? Yeah.
Go ahead, Joe.
Oh yeah, there's definitely a few things you could do with that. So there's lots of advanced threat platforms built into modern antivirus. That basically acts as an EDR, or you can add some automation that get more like an XDR setup. And you can watch for how, and again, it gets into behaviors. How are these processes behaving? What are they accessing? Are we doing a memory scrape inside of a Word document? Stuff like that. Trying to pull password hashes out. Some of this isn't as crucial on more modern operating systems because they hide the user stuff in a virtualized container, an encrypted container. But you go back in older operating systems, that could be a major issue. You could just do pass the hash or whatever else. But yeah, watching for those behaviors, and how they might spread across from machine to machine, being able to trace that across. That there's lots of different technologies that are very similar out there. I've seen from different vendors, whether it be Microsoft, Checkpoint, whatever. There's going to be a million of them. I could name them all day, but that makes a huge difference. And knowing what vendors to kind of trust, which ones not to, having version controls, application whitelists, all that stuff built into there is huge. And then the other thing that they're starting to do in some of these platforms is also watch for privilege escalation, or even handle the privilege escalation.
That's where I was going to go next. Yep. Good.
Yeah, and that's a major thing. So if you have a developer and everybody's every developer I've ever met's like, I need admin on my machine. It's like, well, you don't. You need your compiler needs admin while you're compiling.
Yes.
And then you need to run it as a user because you're wondering why your code doesn't work when it goes to a user's machine because you ran it in an administrative context, and that's just not going to be accurate. You're going to have bad testing from it. So not it's not even just insider threat, but also development practices.
Yeah. So what do you guys think of what's more important when insider threat program? Is it methodology or is it technology? What makes a bigger difference?
I tend to like methodology because you're actually looking at what are you supposed to be doing? Who's doing what? What's moved? What kind of data is moving across what kind of network specifically? So I prefer the methodology and the anomaly detection versus anything else, honestly, because now you're really because what that does is that describes to yourself and proves to yourself, your own company, that you know what type of data is moving based on what processes on what networks and what other processes so it goes in a process, comes out of a process, right? So if you don't know if you don't know what's happening at GIGO, right, garbage in, garbage out, then you have no idea what's really moving around. But if you know what that looks like, the methodology helps me understand much better personally. That's just my thoughts.
I totally agree. Without methodology, the technology doesn't matter. Because if you don't have a methodology to basically to augment whatever tools you have and to look for new behaviors or do threat hunting, there's no tool that's a threat hunting tool per se. Like, okay, you can do packet capture or whatever, look at logs, but that's not threat hunting. That's just looking at logs. So you might use a technology to figure out a behavior or to help you figure out a behavior, but you need the process to implement that in and to then move it forward. I mean, the technology itself doesn't necessarily matter.
Let's throw the question back at Jeff.
Yeah, I agree. I think in all the years I've done this, technology comes and goes. There's newer technology every 5 minutes, especially in cybersecurity. But as a CISO, I don't have time to go through every piece of technology and figure out what's going to work.
As a CISO, my job is not to be a world engineer. Not at all. Yeah. That is not my job.
That's my job.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not at all.
But it's that methodology.
Yeah.
It's that methodology,
right? That involve engineering or involve security, but that's where CISO is. Right? I'm not the engineer anymore. Joe can run smoke circles around me all day long, engineering wise, because I don't do that anymore. I manage business decisions. So, Jeff, let me ask you a question. We got another question from the audience here. I'm going to take probably 2 or 3 more questions from the audience here as they come up, and then we'll go ahead and start wrapping this up a little bit. I mean, we're not wrapping right now, but in about 15 minutes, I'm going to start wrapping this up. But so the question to you, Jeff, is what do you find the most common thing in quotes that security teams tend to overlook and not keep in mind when developing out their strategies in relation to insider threats?
Threat modeling.
Threat model?
And that goes both. I mean, when you look at doing a threat model for your organization, it's about data, but then what data is most important, who has access, right? It's very similar to outside threat modeling, but my experience that people haven't slowed down enough to look at that. They rush to put a program together, buy a couple of tools to monitor data usage, user awareness, user access, but then they get caught up in those cycles that Joe just talked about. All this data, all this stuff I got to figure out. And they think that's an insider threat program. Goes back to the methodology for me.
Goes back to methodology for you. So what social engineering awareness training do you recommend? Or do you even recommend social awareness and training anymore because of technologies that we use, like IDS, IDPS, IPS individually? Do you still recommend we do social engineering awareness training?
Absolutely. That helps all the way around, right? You as an employee, but you and your house, managing your kids and your family, right? It is not going to go away. So many more organizations the bad guys are exercising more techniques and procedures that revolve themselves around espionage. And espionage is much more quiet. So it will involve social engineering. It will involve social media exploits. It will involve things you don't think about. And the bad guys have an opportunity to sit around all day and dream up these ideas, right? And they can get it right. So I mean that's a common issue. There's 8 or 9 different biogenetics companies in and around Boston right now that I'm aware of, that I know about. And they all have pretty significant IP doing their genetic work. I mean, this is amazing stuff these companies are doing. And one of the 9 has a CISO. The others have IT directors, and a couple people have no one dedicated to security. The IP that's being developed, the targeting that and the social engineering around that is phenomenal, right? We sat back and watched that over the summer, how that was just evolving over two of these 9 companies I talked about. It's amazing to see happen. So the bad guys are going to get smarter. They're going to use more creepy tactics, if you will, of social engineering to be able to get access to your personal information or your company's information through your own network. So it's not going away. So having that training absolutely every day, all the time, once a month, once a week. I mean, might be a pain in the butt, but it's going to help everybody.
Yeah, I see companies looking for the next tool rather than dealing with their users and dealing with training.
Yeah.
The reality is technology is awesome. It does exactly what we tell it to do. But I don't know about you, Jeff. I mean, or Joe, I, as a CISO, have to be right 100% of the time to keep the bad guys out, right? They just got to get lucky once, right? And so I can't always look for the next tool. I actually got to train people. That's just my nickel. People have to be aware of it. The social engineering, the phishing, the smishing, et cetera. My opinion, we just need to train our users so that when they see something, say something. I would drop anything to stop a breach because somebody said, "Hey, should I open this in email? This doesn't look funny." If somebody stopped and asked me, I will drop anything, run right to your desk. If I have to physically get up, go to your desk, I'll do that to help to stop a breach. But that's just my nickel. I do have a question from the audience here real quick. Joe, maybe you could speak on this, and then Jeff, maybe you can as well. Could you speak on the IPS and firewalls? Basically, how network security plays a role in detecting and mitigating insider threats?
Oh, wow. That's an interesting one. I mean, as far as it goes, IDS, that's more intrusion, stuff coming in. But that's going to play into behaviors as well, because you're going to have these access logs, you're going to have everything else, and that builds your picture of what the user is doing. And that picture, that story, that's how you can figure out what process they're trying to do or what behavior that they're exhibiting. So the intrusion might not be, somebody that's might not be a bad actor. They might have taken a credential, or it might be a bad actor who stole a credential. Have bad MFA, like you're using SMS still or something along those lines, or they left a copy of their QR code on the screen and somebody duplicated their token. Something like that could have happened. Or when they're re-enrolling, somebody captured your token. That's why having better MFA practices and having apps that require you to put in the number that's on your screen and tying it to a specific device is important. But the IDS helps build out your picture and allows you to do those behavioral analytics to say, okay, they accessed from here, but they're supposed to be in New York, but they're accessing from Russia, or they're accessing from Ohio. Let's not even go out of country. That's impossible, unless they're using things that you don't want. So if they're using a VPN, sure, you might see that, but why are you allowing users on public VPNs to connect to your network? So that would be a potential breach or a way to detect it as well, or to utilize that inside of your insider threat.
Awesome.
Yep. I agree with Joe. I think good points. I think the challenge with that is you can't do that for everything you see, clearly, because then you have to hire 50 more people to monitor all the logs and get in weeds.
50 people to watch those 50 people. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it becomes very onerous, and it's not a long-term solution. So being able to take a step back, and you guys have said this already, right? The threat modeling piece. What's your most important data? Who's most likely to access that data? Don't look at the person. Look at their credentialed access, right? Because, again, as we said at the beginning of this, bad guys come in, look at your network, and they want to upskill their credentials. They want to look like an administrator so no one can see them. So you watch those administrator accounts. You do a threat modeling around those administrator accounts. You do threat modeling around accounts that you wouldn't think are administrator accounts, right? The assistant who works with a CFO, they are a target in the organization as from a bad guy's perspective. So if I want to look like an insider, if I'm a bad guy and I want to look like an insider threat, I want to go look like the assistant to the CFO. So then the admins can't find me. and I can go in there and suck up all the data. And when I'm ready to leave, it's too late for everybody, right? So again, it's that threat modeling piece, I think, in the middle layer. And then what Joe said, all how do you use the IDS and what capacity and what processes you use? Because if you don't approach it from that way, then you're trying to do that with everybody. That's just not attainable. There's just too much work otherwise.
So, Joe, what's your take on network segmentation and firewalling between the segments?
Oh, geez. Well, if a server doesn't need to talk to a server, they don't allow it. So, in more modern things, you might have, network security groups, and, I can apply that to a machine or a network, and you layer these things. So, this app can't talk to that app. And, why does an end user have to talk to a database? We have application servers that talk to caching servers that talk to databases. So, even the application doesn't need to talk to the database, and it only needs to talk through a certain port with a certain user with a certain level of access. And that's that's a major thing with segmentation. Like, segment not just the computers from each other, but the ports and the protocols from each other. There's no reason that the web server needs to connect on the RDP port to the database server, or SSH from one thing to another. It needs to go to the Redis and then go to the the actual data in the backend. So, that's a major part. Not allowing users to access the network directly is another thing. So there's products, for example, like Zscaler, where you can basically have a per application VPN based on a user's profile access. And, you can use that to control the access to the applications, and the applications can't get out to each other. So even if somebody breaches that user against the application, they can't log into that server because all they have access to is port 443. They can't get a reverse shell out because that server's not allowed to connect to the internet, and they can't. It's just, you can't traverse the network as easily or at all in a lot of these cases. So what does it need? Well, it needs inbound access from the update server. It needs to be able to get scanned, or it needs the agent to be able to report out and then have stuff pushed to it. But it doesn't need to access the internet per se. So that's just I could keep going for years on this. That's the basics. Yeah, I can. So
Absolutely. Okay, so let me ask you this, Jeff. At the end of today, we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm happy to use the full 10 minutes. What would you say is your favorite, or what is your recommended user or risk management framework? So let's talk about risk managers for a second. So do you have a risk framework that you would prefer to use? And if you do have a risk management framework, why is your preference?
Sure. I use two, actually, in conjunction. The NIST CSF, it's designed for it's not technical. A lot of people think it's technical. The CSF is not technical. It's designed to manage business risk. It's the bridge, if you will, between technical and the business folks. That's how it was originally designed. I think that's key because that helps people translate what's going on into terms that are bite-sizable and actionable for the board, for senior non-technical executives. So that's key. But I also use that in conjunction with the CIS 18. That's been around for a long time. Used to be the CIS 20 or the SANS 20 or CAG, right? I think we talked about that before, Rick. Right. So it's been around for a long time. The difference is between the two. The CSF is, again, it's that strategic business view of how to run and manage cybersecurity risk. The CIS 18 is how to operationalize security in your organization. Very tactical, very practical, right? There's 40 some different frameworks in the world today, 40, I think 47 or 48 at this point. We're talking everything from Saudi Arabia having their own, to Singapore having their own, to Hong Kong now having their own, to the standard ones we know about, HIPAA, PCI, etc. The CSF is broad enough to cover business, which is important. There's a few others that do that, but I have yet to find any other framework like CIS 18 that's practical and tangible that applies to all of security for your organization. PCI is just servers. HIPAA is just healthcare information. PCI is just financial data on servers. HIPAA is just healthcare information. So that it's very scoped. CIS 18 is broad and it focuses on cyber operations. Combining those two is a win. I've had the opportunity to implement the CIS 20 over 50 times since 2010. and the
Oh,
NIST CSF 19 times. Yeah, I've done it so many times. I'm an advisor to CIS, so I'm very familiar with it because I've helped revise it and edit it and audit it for so many years. Because I needed a framework when I first found out about it in 2007. I first found out about it then, and it just really worked for me as a CISO, and I just watched it progress and develop. And again, it's just a great operational framework that I've used consistently to build SOCs and to run cyber operations. But again, to your point, to your question, the business side is so critically important. I've learned to make those two together, so I can have those conversations. I talk to a CISO and a CIO about cyber operations, what they need to do. Talk to a board of directors on or a CEO about, hey, here's how your top risks are for your enterprise program. Here's how they map to what the technical team's doing, and here's what you got to invest in, right? So those are my two. I don't know. What do you guys think? What have you guys heard? What do you like?
Joe, what about you? What risk framework do you prefer to use, if any?
Well, a lot of times we've been just running inside a NIST. It depends on the client. So the thing is, sometimes most of the time I go in and they have a framework they want to follow. Everyone says, "Oh, I want to follow NIST, some NIST standard," and you're like, "Okay," and then you start mapping your tool. You do your gap analysis. It's like, okay, this will fit. But the I think the thing that we usually miss is the how do you communicate that to the board to get priority on the technical aspect instead of just checking boxes? Because a lot of times what happens is your security and compliance office are together. It's one person or two people, and they're just like, okay, well, we need to have this technology. We need to have DLP, and they think that tagging is DLP. Just stuff like that. But that's the control that they understood when they read it, and they're like, oh, we solved it in 10 minutes. And well, no, no, you didn't.
No, you
And
didn't.
this is why. But yeah, I think I'm going to take away from Jeff on that is using that other framework to help communicate with the C level, the C suite.
Yep. And there's a couple of different NISTs, right? Every people think.
Oh, absolutely.
NIST
Depends on the industry you're in and which one will apply. But
like
but
853. 853 is broadly
right.
used, which
I've done
is
this years, and I can't
which
make
is
53 pass every time.
it's crazy. Yeah, it's crazy. It's too big, right?
Yeah, it's way too big. Yeah, I've seen a few others that were. Well, again, it comes down to none of them that I had seen before. I'll have to take a look at the ones that you're talking about that can actually talk to the C-suite. Because that's I think that's a big thing. Is you take somebody that's like myself, engineer and architect, been doing this for forever. Being able to translate that to exec speak isn't always the easiest thing.
Yep.
So that's definitely a challenge.
Yep. So identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, and now govern.
Now governance, my favorite.
Yeah, that should stick, right? So
governance is in there.
But when you ask those questions to the business, is identify what's your most important information, what's your most important business data, what's your most important plans, right? And that's not technical at all.
Nope.
And the CEOs are like, oh, okay, then this kind of makes sense. Exactly. And now here's how we've identified the technical needs, both IT and cyber, to support what you just said is important, right? Right. And then lights go on, right? I love those conversations because they're like, oh, okay, this is starting to make sense. There's a roadmap here. Exactly.
And I've tried to aid that roadmap too. So most recently in DLP, I started, doing stuff with data stewards, and basically we have our building blocks of what can happen in DLP, the technologies, and we gave them common words, and then we tell them to build stories around their data using those words, and they can tell us how to work. So they're generating the requirements by building a user story.
Yep,
and then re-engineer that and architect that, figure out how the rules work so we can have that result. And then we also, of course, do a full regression, make sure that all the other rules still apply.
Yeah.
But that's been a huge help as well in communication.
So I have one more question for you, Jeff. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead, Jeff.
No, I didn't have anything to say. Go ahead.
So I got one more viewer question. How do you tackle international organizations that's subject to multiple frameworks? So if you have GDPR, for example, and CCPA and NYDFS, I mean, you can go alphabet soup here all day long with a different frameworks or different regulatory agencies. I mean, I fell into ERCOT for a while. Oh my God, I hate ERCOT. That's just my opinion. But how do you tackle that? How do you deal with that with organizations with multiple frameworks across organizations. How do you deal with it?
Yeah,
I'm laughing.
I've had that too. I've had
Yeah.
I've had setups of that. One of them was GDPR, Bermuda, NYDFS. And initially it was Bermuda first, and then NYDFS and GDPR that fell in there, and of course that just kept on turning the screws tighter. And sometimes when you make yourself compliant with one, you fall out with the other.
Yep.
So that gets into a large architectural nightmare where you need to segment off your users and your data into different areas, build up information barriers and everything else. It's really an architecture issue and an access control issue. Where is the data stored? Who's accessing it? Where? Because I'm accessing NYDFS data in Europe, it's NYDFS and GDPR, and it might not be congruent. So that's usually a major issue. So you have to move the data and eliminate access, and ensure that people are only accessing things through where they should.
Do you think so? Okay, so you absolutely believe that the frameworks should remain segregated, Joe? Or
no, they should. We need to come up with a global framework, I'm sure. But there really isn't one. Like, there's nothing you can do to be inside of all of them. It's just not possible right now. You'll fall in compliance with one and out of compliance with what is it, 47 others.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Then that's just how that's going to work. I mean, you can follow a lot of zero trust stuff; they'll cover you on most of it, but you're going to be 80 or 90% compliant across the board. You'll never be 100%. And of course, compliance is just that. I mean, some of it's even just planning. You'll say, "Oh, how are you going to solve this?" You'll say, "Okay, we're going to discover that over the next year," and then you get to the next year, and you're like, "Okay, we've discovered these things. Now we're going to try to move towards this." You don't necessarily have to ever be 100% compliant in any of them, but you always have to have plans on how to move yourself closer.
Yeah.
Yep,
I wouldn't say you don't have to be 100% compliant. Well, you should be.
You try, you're not.
We all know the truth.
So,
we all try.
About 7 years ago, that same question came up with a group at CIS that I was working with at the time. And it's a really community defense model is really what the CIS 18 is about, right? We take feedback from community every year, collate that information, then reproduce something or update or edit, really. So a couple of really smart people who had some extra time on their hands and leveraged a bunch of us to help feed this document. We developed crosswalks. Now, they're not for all 47, but it's got CSF and then what compliance frameworks map each area of the CSF. CIS 18, what compliance frameworks map with the CIS 18. So you can pull up an Excel doc, Excel doc that we've got, and you should be able to go to CIS.org. It's up, they have the mappings for maybe 18 of different standards in the world and see how the CIS applies to those 18. So GDPR EMEA, GDPR UK, different, but the same, but different.
They say they're the same, but they're not.
Yeah, no, they're not.
So, but if you go to CIS.org, it's already been mapped. So people can access that and say, if it's PCI, it hasn't mapped to CIS 18. Oh, it's this. So at least you've got a starting place to go from.
Because I did a GDPR. It took me a year and a half to get GDPR in place in the organization. And I did exactly that. I went CIS, downloaded the crosswalk, went along PCI, went along the stuff where we had to be, and along GDPR. Where do we match? Okay, that's great. That's all wonderful. But what doesn't match or what's competing?
Yep, exactly. And that's what you map. So, and people, when you approach situations like that, especially when it's international, you say to your folks, "Hey, look, we're going to find more gaps, and we might find alignment here, but you got to understand, once we're done with this, you're going to have to make some executive decisions on compliance. It's a business decision, right? Do you want to go with this framework or that framework, and what's the legal ramifications, especially for international?" So.
Yeah, I've seen them. Okay, what's cheaper to pay?
Yeah,
literally,
exactly.
It's a business decision, right?
Yep.
It's like they find $50,000 a day for throwing $300,000 away. You keep getting paid, for instead of spending $300,000, you keep paying that $50,000. It's cheaper than that $300,000 all day long.
Yeah,
yep, happens all the time. You don't spend $1 million to protect 1,000 all the time. Yep. Awesome. So Jeff, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up, and I want to start with you, and then I'm going to go to Joe. What at the end of today's discussion? This has been a great discussion, by the way, guys. I really appreciate you both being on the panelists today. I really do. What would be the 3 or 4 things, Jeff, that you would want somebody to walk away from this conversation understanding? What would you want them to learn out of today's conversation?
Inside of a threat program development is not a tool; it's a methodology and a process. There's good methodologies and processes that are out there. Go to Carnegie Mellon. Go to, even DHS has got a good framework to leverage to start with, at least. Won't fit for everybody, but at least it gives you a direction to go in. And keep in mind, insider threats are business decisions. They're not technical. They're not cyber. They're business decisions. They're executed by cyber and IT, but you've got to get the business invested in the concept going forward.
Joe, what about you? What are you hoping to impart on our audience today before we leave? What did you want them to walk away from learning something new, or what you would stress?
I would stress the whole thing of making sure that you're always going back over your configurations, making sure that you're covering everything off. Try to get some behavioral analytics in there that's beyond just traditional SIM or traditional IDS. Try to tie all that stuff together, and user training. User training is worth more than anything. That's probably 90% of your issues are going to come from user training. And that's assuming that you've secured your identities correctly and mitigated your east-west.
That was one of mine. Is user access reviews. Do them regularly. Do them all the time. Not just for your end users, but also for your admins and your processes, because that's the one thing I see a lot of
external users too. You can invite users into your tenant from outside. Make sure you watch them.
Third party. Yep.
Okay. Awesome.
Exactly.
Okay, guys. I appreciate everything today. I appreciate your time, Jeff. I hope you'll come back to us. Joe, I hope you'll come back and
Yep.
I really want to say you guys had some great knowledge, and we really appreciate your time. And everyone in our audience, we hope you've gotten something from this, and we wish you a good week and see you next week. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Rick.
Thanks, Rick.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jeff.
Take care.
Take care.